I think we might begin, if that's okay with our speakers today. All right, kia ora, and welcome everyone to the Fulbright New Zealand Good Works Alumni Seminar for June 2022. Today's seminar is called Ngā Reo me ngā Pukapuka Tamariki Languages and Children's Books. And we are very, very delighted to have three experts in the field of children's literature who are going to share a range of perspectives on the importance of languages in children's picture books, especially in Aotearoa. So today's panel includes Nicola Daly from the University of Waikato. Nicola is a sociolinguist and associate professor in the Division of Education at the University of Waikato, where she teaches children's literature. Her work explores multilingualism and language hierarchies in children's picture books, recognising the power of this often underestimated format in the development of language attitudes. Nicola was a Fulbright New Zealand scholar to the University of Arizona in 2019. Our next speaker is Eboni Waitere from Huia Publishers. Eboni is the Executive Director of Huia Publishers, a publishing house that specialises in telling Māori and Pacific stories with a long history in publishing in Te Reo Māori. She attended ko Ngā Reo and kura kaupapa Māori as a child and studied Māori and education at Victoria University of Wellington. Eboni is a strong advocate for Māori medium education and co-chair of Te Runanga o Ngāti Kahunganu ki te whanganui ātara. Apologies for that mispronunciation there. Our third panelist this afternoon is Julia Marshall. Julia is the founder and publisher of Gecko Press, a small by choice independent publisher of curiously good books for children since 2005. Gecko Press translates and publishes books by some of the best writers and illustrators in the world for ages 0 to 12, as well as a small number of books by New Zealand writers and illustrators. Julia is immediate past president of Te Reo o Takupu Publishers Association New Zealand and a strong advocate for children having the right to love to read. Thanks so much. So I'm now going to pass it over to Nicola, who's our first presenter today. Thanks.
Kia ora, Therese. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā haue whā, e ngā rangatira mā, e ngā whetu o Matariki. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. It gives me great pleasure to be speaking alongside these two very distinguished publishers in New Zealand. I research picture books, but Eboni and Julia actually publish them, so I have the easy job, definitely. You've heard about their two publishing companies just now from Therese, so I'll just tell you a little bit about the structure of today. I'm going to speak first about my work with picture books and focusing a little bit on my work in Arizona on the Fulbright New Zealand Scholarship. And then I'm going to hand over to Eboni, who's going to speak about the importance of illustrations and representation in picture books. And Julia will talk about books and translation after that. And then we're aiming to leave about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So if you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat and we'll come to them. Thank you. So I'm going to start with this quote from John Stevens, who's a children's literature academic in Australia. And I think I chose it to start with because it kind of explains why I'm interested in children's picture books particularly. But even more broadly, children's books are cultural artifacts. They reflect the values and ideologies of the society in which they're produced. And as Therese has already mentioned, my work really looks at how children's picture books that involve more than one language tell us about how those languages are valued and whether there are hierarchies, whether those hierarchies support the established hierarchy or disrupt the established hierarchy. Those are the kinds of things I'm interested in. And multilingual picture books are not new by any means. One of the first known ones is called Orbis Pictus, written and published by the Czech teacher John Amos Comenius. And you can see it was published in 1658 in Latin and German, and in 1666 it came out in Latin, French, German and Italian. So those range of languages that this book first came out in tells you something about A, who the publisher thought the audience was, and B, which languages were important in that part of the world at that time. So multilingual picture books do tell us a bit about what is important and who is important. My previous work with multilingual picture books began with a study of Māori loanwords, or in English text of New Zealand picture books. So by loanwords, I'm talking about words that come from the Māori language and are woven into the English language. And I noticed that it was happening a lot in the books I was reading to my daughter. And so I studied that. I based my work on, it was very much influenced by the work of John McAllister at the Victoria University of Wellington, who has done a lot of work looking at how the distinctive contribution Māori language makes in New Zealand English. And when I looked at 13 picture books that had been published by Huia Publishers between 1995 and 2005, there was a very high rate of use of Māori words in the English text, 56 per thousand. And when I compared this to the work of John McAllister in other corpora such as newspapers, Hansard records, New Zealand school journals, this was way more frequent. And when I left these 13 books with kindergarten families for a month and asked them to incorporate the books into their ordinary reading with their children whenever they read across that month, I wanted to answer the question, did reading those picture books with the high frequencies of Māori words woven into the text affect the parents' language use? And of course, that would have affected the children's language use as well. And when I came back and interviewed them at the end of the month, the parents said yes. It depended on where they were in their Māori language use already. Some of them were already learning Māori and proficient in Māori. These were Pākehā families. And the people who were more proficient said it kind of supported their current use, and the people who may not have been as confident felt that they were becoming more confident in using the words and knowing how to use them in context. But another surprising thing that they said to me, I wasn't expecting this, they said how important they felt the books were for supporting their national identity as New Zealanders, and the fact that the Māori language was there was very much part of that. So I went on from those studies to look at the different ways that books in English language bring in Māori words. And I talk about 3 different kinds of these books. And one of them I call translingual. It's also called interlingual, where you've got a story in one language with other words borrowed into it. And of course, in the New Zealand context, I was looking at English language text with Māori words woven in, but there are all sorts of other combinations of those language connections across the world. But an example from the Haere Farewell, Jack Farewell by Tim Tepene and Huhana Smith from Huia Publishers is this line, I saw whānau I hadn't seen in ages, even my sister who was hapu. So you've got the English as the dominant text with some Māori words woven into that text. The second kind of bilingual or multilingual text we talk about is called bilingual or multilingual, where you've got the stories told fully in 2 or more languages. And Kei Te Pehe Koe, How Do You Feel by Tracy Duncan is an example of this. The cover's on the right, and you can see that you've got the Māori title and then the English title, and then underneath the text on this slide, you have an example of a page inside the book where the answer to the question, how do you feel, comes in a whole lot of different colours and a lot of different feelings, but here is Kei te wera o, I feel hot. So Māori is first, English is second. And when I look at these books, I'm particularly interested in which language is first, which language is second. Are some languages given more space than others? And then the third kind of multilingual, bilingual text that I look at is called multiversion. And these multiversions can come either in 2 forms, and the first of those is simultaneous, and both Huia and Gecko publish books in this way, where you have a book published in English and Māori at the same time. So some very recent titles from Huia Mokopuna Matatini and Koe Whetu Rangitia a Koro have both been published in Māori and in English, and also Koro or Pops from Gecko Press. And then a second kind of multiversion is where you have asynchronous publication, where there's a book published in one language somewhere, And a bit later on, a translation is published. And here we have an example from Gecko and Huia. So Duck Death and the Tulip was first published in 2007, and then in German and translated into English in 2009 by Gecko Press. And if I've got those dates wrong, Julia will tell you. And then, of course, we've got the Gruffalo, first published in 1999 in English and translated into Te Tanguruhau by Huia Press, Huia Publishers in 2013. So you can see there's a range of different ways in which languages are brought together in picture books, and I'm interested in all of those different kinds. I've focused in on different kinds at different parts of my my research journey. I want to say a little bit about the University of Arizona, where I was located for 4 months at the end of 2019, returning just about a month before we went into lockdown. So I was very lucky. I was in Tucson, Arizona, in a very, very large university compared to the University of Waikato. I was situated in the Worlds of Words Centre, which is an amazing centre that focuses on bringing children's literature from around the world into one space to ensure that United States children get a chance to see picture books from around the world. This is an amazing centre that's really inspiring for me. It produces 3 journals about the use of children's literature in education. It hosts illustrator and author visits. It hosts exhibitions. It loans out books, boxes and backpacks about books from around the world to various educational institutions. And since I've returned to New Zealand, I've been able to implement a few of these ideas into where I work. My Fulbright research was across a 6-week period at a global cultures club, which was being run as an after-school club in a Latinx neighborhood in Arizona for 9 to 11-year-olds. We ran a 90-minute session for 6 weeks, and we introduced books in the first few weeks in languages that the children were familiar with, English and Spanish. Then we introduced books that they weren't so familiar with, Māori, English and Māori. And then in the last few weeks, we looked at books that featured Indigenous languages from around the United States. And we gathered data as we worked with the children. And we were looking at, one of the things we're looking at is when children are exposed to books like these, what working theories do they make about language? What ideas do they have about language, and how do they revise them according to what they see in the books in front of them? And we heard the children really making all sorts of interesting working theories about what language is. What does it mean to know a language? And how is language learned? And across the 6 weeks, we could see them building on their working theories as we returned to books that featured different languages. So why do language and picture books matter? They matter to me because they're such a huge part of language acquisition, whether by deliberately or not. They support working theories about language amongst children, like the research I've just mentioned, and they help develop critical language awareness amongst pre-service teachers, which is another aspect of the research that I did while I was away. They also support parents maintaining Indigenous languages, and there are several studies that support that. So they're really important to me as a sociolinguist from a range of different perspectives. And now I'm going to pass over to Eboni, and she'll tell you her perspectives on this.
Kia ora no tātou, ko hui hui mai nei tēnei ahiahi, ngā mihi kia koutou. Tēnā koe Nicola, nau whakatūwhera mai I tēnei wāhi mōku. Ko Eboni Waitere ahau no Ngāti Kahungunu no Rangitāne, and te koutou pia hau e mahi ana I Huia. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to say hello and also acknowledge that we're about to have a matariki holiday on Friday, so ngā mihi kia koutou pēnei wā. I guess I'll just introduce a little bit, I'll introduce to you Huia and a little bit more talk a little bit about our publishing house before I talk more about language. So we're about 30 years old now. We've been publishing for 30 years, and we're both an education publisher and a trade publisher, and in that 30 years we've published about 1,000 books. And so Māori language in Māori, so we've published quite a few books, but in Māori language we've published about 1,000. And I guess Māori language is important to us, but so is the whole ecosystem that supports the valuing Māori language. So having Māori authors, having Māori perspectives, and having Māori settings are all things that are very important to us. So in that time, we've also published, probably now that we're about 31, closer to 500 Māori authors, and we've also done lots of work and brought Māori illustrators to publishing as well. Given that the Māori language is in it needs lots of support to survive, publishing works that are in Māori language and valuing Māori language is important to us. Representation within those books is also important to us, as well as us opening a window, I guess, through the settings that we provide to the rest of the world, to other Indigenous people as well. So those are all things that we value here at Huia. Oops. As an education publisher, we have published works that have literacy progressions in them. And one of the things that you have to think about when you're publishing works like this is thinking about high frequency words, thinking about literacy progressions for those readers. We've got two different examples here that we've published. One is works that we've translated from the Buddy series. We had to, after translating it, we then also had to consider high frequency words and which words people learned first. So in English, A or A is the first word that they learnt, and in Te Reo Māori that's different, and that's not necessarily the highest frequency word in Te Reo Māori. So there were a whole range of considerations we had to make, and we also had to relook at those translations and re-level some of these stories in that first set. In the second set, we've got one that is an original works from Huia, where it was a little bit easier in that we already had the high frequency words that we wanted to start with. We knew we wanted colours, shapes, over and under, and numbers all presented in those stories. Now for us, reading is a skill, and it's important that Māori language reading children are offered a range of series or literacy progression options so that they can learn how to read. And it doesn't really matter which language you learn how to read, as long as you're inspired to read and that you're learning that skill. And there's lots of options, I guess, in other languages, but there's not too many that are available in Te Reo Māori. One of the other features, I guess, in the Buddy series that we had to really think about is that there's a swimming lane in there. So that helps teachers or parents to ask questions of the reader. So while the text is really simple with only 2 or 3 words on each page, the illustrations are really there to enhance the story and make it, to give it a bit more of a story arc. But the swimming lane is there for the adult to ask the child a series of questions to help them engage with the story. We had to really think whether or not we would translate those into Māori or if we would left them in English. And we thought about it partly because a lot of parents are English speakers, where their children are actually learning how to read in a Māori language environment through Ngā Reo or through kura kaupapa. In the end, we decided to translate the swimming lanes and those questions into Māori because we thought it was also an opportunity for the parents to learn how to speak Māori or how to read Māori, and it gave them a chance to engage in Te Reo Māori as well with their children. We've published, we've translated these titles from English. These are popular stories. And I guess over the years we have come up with a criteria that we look at before we decide which ones we're going to translate. In the early days, we didn't quite have that, a plan around that, although we did know that Te Anu He Tino Hia Kai, the Hungry Caterpillar, and Where the Wild Things had been translated into more than 50 languages, I think, around the world. So we knew that they were really popular. But but now we think a little bit more about representation, I guess. So you'll see that there's animals and wild things, I guess, more frequently in the books that we choose to translate as opposed to people. So those are some of the things we think about. We also consider whether or not they work in terms of translation into Māori. So some things that have puns or even some works like He Wāhi Te Ruma, they do have a beat to them. And so when you're translating, you do need to think about whether or not you can maintain the integrity of the story and use words that are familiar to children, as well as keep within that rhythm and rhyme. So there's a number of considerations we factor in when we're making a decision on which books we'll translate into Te Reo Māori. We've also translated He Anu He Tino Hia Kai and Kei Reira Ngā Wiriwiri into Samoan, although we wouldn't consider ourselves an expert in that particular area. However, over the years, I guess we've come up with a house style that suits us. So, Nicola, you've taught me a few things today. We would call these Māori versions and English versions rather than translations. So we do a Māori version, and we do this because we think that they're different audiences. So we think children who are learning Te Reo Māori or already are speaking Te Reo Māori, they want a book that has all Māori language words in it. There's plenty of other books on the market that have English versions or English stories. So it's really important for us to serve that community of readers. And then we do an English version. And as Nicola has said, we often use Māori words. So the 8 gifts of Te Wheke being an octopus. And so it's common for us, usual for us and normal for us to use Māori language words in English text, but it's not very normal for us to use an English word in a Māori text. And as you can see, we've also probably moved on from having the Māori version and English version with the same covers to now we move more towards having different covers, and that's so that readers can actually distinguish the difference between the books. I'll talk a little bit about Santa's Worst Christmas next, but the other thing I'd just say is that The Bomb has also been translated into, the rights have been sold into the US, and the title of that is called The Cannonball. So even within English, there's lots of changes that occur. In terms of representation, we think that that's also really critical for our publishing. We want to make sure that our storytelling reflects the people that we see in our daily lives and in our readers. Often books we've seen have got very stereotypical views of Māori. So for us, Māori people come in all shapes and sizes. Some have red hair. Some do kapahaka and some are a little bit quirky and travel to the moon. So it's important for us to have a broad representation of our people and doing amazing and fantastic things as well. We think that's important for readers of our works to see Māori in that light. So Santa there, we had to think long and hard. For those of you who are in New Zealand about 5 years ago, I think there was a big uproar when Santa at the parade was Māori, a Māori Santa. So in illustrating this Santa, we did have to think long and hard about what we thought Santa would look like. And so we have got a Santa who we think does look like he's a worldly Santa and who travels around the world. But there are some things that Santa has that are Māori, like his gumboots and things like that. Now, Santa does live in the North Pole, but in our story, he also comes to New Zealand where it's summertime at Christmas. So there's lots of considerations, I think, we have to make as publishers when we're representing the group. So the whole story isn't set in where it's winter time and there's snow. You know, we do want to make sure it reflects the sort of Christmas where our children are used to having. So this particular image is, now that it's Matariki, just reflecting on Matariki, it is an example of hautapu where Koro is and his moko are celebrating Matariki with a ceremony. The Te Waka Orangi is travelling across the sky to collect the spirits that are going up. We think that not only is it important for our children to see themselves reflected in the stories, but also see the settings and the lived experiences that they have and valued in our books as well. I'll let Julia talk a little bit about emotions and things like that, but this is once again an example of within a family, some have red hair and some have dreadlocks, and all of those representations and characters are important to us, as well as the Indigenous storytelling, but also making sure that those stories are genuine and that the authors have a level of story sovereignty that supports, you know, and that we can support them to do that. And this is just my last slide. Hopefully I haven't gone over too much time. This is a story, a new picture book that we've published, and I've chosen to show this to you because it shows the subtle ways in which we, well, I don't know if they're so subtle, that we make sure that there's representation of Māori things. So you can see that there's a korowai, there's a patu, there's whāriki, there's taonga, there's all those things that are in the story. So this is a standoff between a brother and the octopus, and the brother wants his sister back, and he needs to give the wheke a final gift to have his sister released. So you can see that we've represented Māori characters and Māori themes, but also hopefully telling a story that's engaging to a reader as well and gets them hooked on reading. There's some other subtle things happening too around consumerism and around the environment as well, but I won't go into that too much.
Kia ora, Eboni. That's such a wonderful new picture book. I actually haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm hoping to soon. Okay, so we're back to Julia. Can you see that, Julia? We can't hear you at the moment.
I can see that, thank you. Kia ora tātou katoa. Ko Julia tōku ingoa. I'm from Gecko Press, and thank you both for those introductions, and I just love listening to Nicola and to Eboni, and many questions I have, but here is Gecko Press. If you could have my next moment. Thank you. This is because Eboni had a good slide, so I've given us one that says a little bit of what is the core of Gecko Press. Our get out of bed is that every child has the right to love to read. And what that tells to me is that we're not really, that we are in the business of reading for the love of it. And so some of the academic considerations for us, they're inherent, but not core. We say that what Gecko Press does is that every year we publish around 18 new children's books, and as you said, Nicola, from 0 to 12, but we say sometimes infinity. And we choose books from the rest of the world that we think, I now describe them as books of good heart and strong character. sometimes we like to choose books that we think behave badly, even when they know how to. We've started to think of the books as sort of a little bit, I can't think what the word is, amorphous or something. Of our books, the majority of the books we publish, if you have the next, please. Next slide. Just so you have something different to look at. The books that we publish, about of the 18, about 15 of those are translated every year. We work hard to keep them in print and to build new readers for those books. So we, as a publisher, we're long, I think 50% of what we publish is backlist, which is unusual, I think. Well, we like it anyway. So we're really we're not looking to follow trends or if we would never, for instance, try to publish a new Harry Potter because we think there's a really good one already. And so what we're looking for in these stories are books that have really, really strong stories for us. And for me, that means, we'll see actually in some of the books that I'm showing you, it implies, I think we sometimes, I think, in publishing have too low expectations of children. And so we really, we like to ask a bit of them sometimes. Could I have the next slide? This is a little book called All the Dear Little Animals. It's one of the very early books. You'll know this one, Margaret. I can see you there. And it's the story of three children. The oldest girl there, she's bossy. The next child is the narrator, and he writes poetry and is quite shy and thinks a lot. And that's Pati on the right. He's the youngest child, and his job is to cry. This book was published, just back to what Eboni was saying, this book was published first in Sweden. And in the Swedish, it was the title translated as all the little dead animals. And my German friend who published it at the same time, and that's why we became friends, they published it as The Best Funerals in the World. His book sold, more than 40,000 copies. We think that was a good title. I'd do that again if I could. And I had been to a bookshop and they said, oh, you mustn't publish a book with death in the title or dead. I had no idea that you didn't do that. So eventually we called it All the Dear Little Animals and got round it. And in the original version, there were on the end papers little crosses, a little cemetery. And I'm ashamed to say that we got slightly rid of that in the first version, but we have put it back in a later version. So this is us learning how to be stand by ourselves, I guess, as we go. So if you see the next page, the next slide, the reason why I've chosen this book is because I think that as a picture book, it has, for me, it's like a little novel. It has plot, drama, an enormous amount of emotion, humor right alongside that emotion, language in it. It's got poetry because he's busy writing poems, and it has a story arc. And that the children, the oldest, I'm talking too long about this book, but the oldest one on the first line of this book is one day we had nothing to do, so we decided to set up a company called Funerals Limited for all the poor dead animals because somebody must. And so they steadily start to bury more and more animals, and the grandmother provides fish, and eventually they get up to roadkill, and there's just such an enormous amount of character between each child. And this is something that we we seldom find in a picture book, and I just love it when you get it. And sadly, that amount of, I don't know, this, in our Anglo-Saxon world, I find that we parents can be afraid of this amount of text even. So we republished this as a chapter book because it does have quite a lot of words. In English books now, we're on a slow slide down to nothing really. So that's probably enough about that book. If I could go to the next one, this is we for a while I just had no idea that this was abnormal. I got sent this book, Duck, Death and the Tulip, and I thought, gosh, that's lovely, what a very funny duck. And then if you see the next page, then it is quite confronting. And but it's a very good book, and actually Kate de Goldie helped me with the courage to publish this book. And I love having it. It's now one of our best-selling books. And for me, there's a lot in this book I could talk about. At the time, there were 70 librarians. I read their listserv, and the response gauged from, does anyone else hate this book, to stories of children taking it into the playground, talking about it, and taking it home, talking about it with their parents. So for me, that's one of the things of a picture book, is the conversation and the depth that the picture book brings. It is quite shocking. And so the thing that I really love about this book is that if this is the first time you're seeing it, I am quite sure you will be seeing something different to what I am seeing, because I no longer see that figure of death as a skull. I look at I see the humor in death. He is a he. We decided to make him a he in the end. It has humor, irony, it has philosophy. It asks big questions, and it doesn't answer the questions, which is another thing that we really love in a picture book, that leaves stories open for, and there's a lot of space in it for thinking. And Wolf Elbusch, whose name is difficult to pronounce, but he also is the author of Mind Your Own Business, which is that book about the poo that is sitting on top of the dog kennel that you might remember, that sold millions of copies. Well, this one won't, but it is a really extraordinary book, I think. And whenever we talk to him, he says, just be kind to the duck. And for a while we had that as our motto for the office, just be kind to the duck. And how am I going? I'll go to the next slide. I thought this is the end of the book, when they've gone and I don't know if you can read that, but when Duck was lost to sight, he was almost a little moved, but that's life, thought, duck, death. Catherine Chidgey translated this, and there's a lot to say about translation. We'll go to the next slide, and that's perhaps more in the business of words. This book I chose, this is another older title, but also when we published this book first, this was originally translated in Wellington by Jean Anderson, and then edited as well, which is that process of translation, very important. And when we first published it, we had, for the British English, that was early days for Gecko Press, and we had You Miserable Gherkin, Gumboil, tell me again, who is the strongest? And in America, they don't understand about gherkins, and they wanted to have pickles. And but actually the original French was You Miserable Artichoke, and for some reason, I don't know why we didn't, now I can think, well, artichoke would have been just as good as anything, but I do really love Miserable Gizzard, Gumboil. I think, so I always like this slide, just because it reminds me that sometimes constraints and translation and all these things can result in good. It doesn't always have to be compromise can result in a good outcome. If I could have the next picture. I've just included this, the last sentence. Who me away. That word, to say my internet's gone funny, is right. Yeah, it's right. That word prudently is also a word. I love it. It's a big word. It's the kind of word for a reading child. You don't have to know what it is, but you figure it out. But it's a great word when you're 5 to learn. And if I quickly go to the next, because I think I should finish. I've just included this this image for this was a book that we've just recently translated from the Japanese, and that was pretty fun because a lot of it's got very few words, and again it's got that subversive humor that we really like. It's dry. Some of the parents who we call or librarians or school teachers find the idea that this child is going to put herself into a box and find a better family because she's got a new younger brother called Potato Face. So she thinks she'd like a different family now. And so she waits for people to come and choose her so she can have and they go past sort of one by one and you can see just in so little line what is happening. And the next one is our new Lionel, and he's very, this is a book for toddlers. He's eating, learning to eat, and he's quite pleased with himself at leaving at the end of this, but he's very subversive, and I just think that in the matter of humor, we sometimes underestimate the funniness of that. They get the joke. The children get the joke, even at 2. As in, back to you.
Thank you. Just land on your last.
I did
slide.
have one more. Oh yes, that is the reason why we're here.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Julia. We've done really well with the timing, everyone. Thank you. So we do have time for questions. If anybody has questions to put in the chat, but while we're waiting for them to come in, I will start off with one which occurred to me when I was putting my presentation together and we were working together, the 3 of us. I wondered if you would talk a little bit about why but neither Huia nor Gecko produce bilingual books where you've got the text in both languages. Do you want to go? Who wants to go first?
Shall I go first, because it's a little bit unusual for us to be publishing books in another language that is not our own as well, and like as Eboni says, for us to even publish Gecko Press started publishing about 10 years ago. We decided that some of our best loved books, it would be to take them into Te Reo Māori. And we at the time, particularly with some of the books we were choosing, really felt that if you put another language, as soon as you put the 2 languages together, then we felt we were it became educational for us. And so we put everything into Te Reo Māori. We put the copyright notice, the whole caboodle. It's not a caboodle, but we do. That is the simple answer for us. Thank you, Julia.
I guess we think that they're 2 different audiences. We do think that the children and adults who read the books that are written in Te Reo Māori are Māori language speakers. They're proficient already. So they're not necessarily learning how to speak Māori. They already know how to speak Māori to be able to read those books. And then we think that our books that are in English, and sometimes they are different versions, they're not exact translations of each other, are for audience that may be learning te reo Māori or just want a good story. So we see them as two different audiences. We wouldn't rule out a bilingual book, and we also see that more and more there is an audience, a new audience again, who want to buy bilingual books. They want that, and we understand that there's actually a huge, that they're quite lucrative. But our primary audience, I guess, and the people we want to serve are Māori language speakers, because there's just not enough content for them to devour.
Yes, absolutely. Julia, why do you think it's important for, question for Eboni. Got a question for Eboni from Mary Boyce. Any plans to publish graded vocabulary controlled readers for teens and adults?
That's a good question. We are working on more and more series. So I won't get them for you, Mary. But yes, the short answer is yes. It's something that we're definitely conscious of and thinking about, along with publishing series of works. So what we found when we went overseas is that we did lots of one-off books with authors, but we hadn't actually got a series, and that was made blindly obvious to us when we were with international publishers, and when they were looking at what things they'd like to like from us. So we can see that there's a huge gap in terms of our list for that, and that there's a real opportunity, and that's something that we're definitely looking at.
Thanks, Eboni. Crossing over to you, and any questions, just type them in, but crossing over to you, Julia. Why, I mean, Gecko is founded on finding amazing books from around the world and translating them into English and then putting them back out into the world. I've got that right, haven't I? Kind of, yeah. Why is it important for those books to be translated? Don't we have enough stories here?
The putting them back out into English is that is because Gecko Press is an international company, so our books are sold in the UK, America, Australia and New Zealand, and exported in English versions. That's because we're in a niche, and so we need to do that to even start to survive. And the reason why I think it's important to have books in translation is because I could talk a lot. It's about bringing, it's very important for us to have our own stories, and really critical that we must have our own stories, but it's also, I believe, really important to bring in the outside, to bring the rest of the world in, and to books in translation, it's another way of providing a diversity of thought, of the way people think, the questions different people are asking in different ways. It's a way of just widening the scope, I guess. And if we think that we read both to find out, we read to recognize ourselves and to see ourselves, that is really important. And also we I believe, read to put ourselves into the shoes of others. And so both, I think it's and at the time when I started Gecko Press, only 1% of books published in the UK, for example, were in translation. And it seemed to me that there must be good writers and good illustrators from other countries that we could benefit from.
Absolutely. I mean, my impression is that, in New Zealand, our children get lots of books that are written in English from around the world. But when I say from around the world, they're dominated by books from Britain and books from the USA, aren't they? So this is really increasing the diversity of voices by bringing books from other languages. But
well, I don't think we even get them from Canada, to be fair, or from India, or
we
from
don't.
And mostly they come from the there's more that come from the UK for us in New Zealand than were coming from America.
Mm-hmm.
Even from Australia, we don't. If you were to do as part of your research to think that we've got Mem Fox on Huia's list, which is fantastic, but who else? You know, how many from Australia come into New Zealand, really?
That's a very interesting divide that happens with both children and adults literature, actually. It's like we almost can't see each other. We're too close to see each other.
We don't want everything.
Eboni, can you tell, you've got, I think, am I right that both Mokopuna Matatini and the greatest haka festival in the world are in the finalists for the book awards this year? Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
That's right. Would you like to tell us a bit about that book and bring it into publishing?
Yeah, I mean, here's a little sample of Mokopuna Matatini. So just talking about, I agree with what Julia said around, you know, opening that window to the world and having, and our children being able to read about all different cultures around the world. But as much as you know, even though there's lots of books published in Te Reo Māori, not all of them actually have settings that are Māori. And so Mokopuna Matatini is a real opportunity. It's a whānau who go to the greatest haka festival in the world, Te Matatini, and it's about their experience in Te Matatini. So it was important for us to make sure that children, I mean, thousands of people go to Matatini every 2 years, yet there isn't a book that's been published about it. And Matatini's been going for 30 years too, I think, maybe even 50. It's 50 years. They're celebrating 50 years this year. Now, the other interesting thing, I guess, about Mokopuna Matatini is the number of permissions we went and sought, including permissions from Te Matatini, including permissions from kapahaka groups, including permissions just to illustrate the carvings that they use from Te Puia and Te Matatini on the stage. To the MC, who is, you know, who's quite well known, Te Hamua, to one of the kapahaka superstars. We got permissions for everything. And that seems like a lot of work, and it is, but it's well worth it. It's well worth it to have people come along for the journey. And I guess that's probably the other thing that we love about Matatini. Not only is it an authentic story in Māori, about you know, something that many of us go to every 2 years, but it's also we brought all of those people along on the journey with us in publishing this story.
Mm.
And it's a fantastic cover.
It is a fantastic cover, and I think it was on some of the slides we showed, but I know that you've moved to making the different versions of your books have different covers, haven't you?
Yeah, we're moving more and more into that. If we've got two great covers, then we want to use them. And if we don't, then we'll make sure that we have different colours, just so a buyer can distinguish the difference between the Māori language version and the English version.
Thank you. Well, we've got a last question. I don't think any other questions have come through on the chat, but it's, for me, getting ready for this session together, it's been wonderful because we've had a couple of meetings together, and hearing you both interact with each other. You know, you're both in Wellington, you both have independent publishers, you both got really distinct identities. And I wondered if we could perhaps end with just some comments on what you learned from each other as publishers.
Shall I go first, Eboni?
Sure.
Well, what I admire about Huia and always have is that I think the integrity and the focus, but also in my conversations over the years with Eboni and others, but mostly Eboni, is that clear. It's absolutely a business, and it's people, and I think that trying to do all those things well, right from getting systems and dealings with people. So those are, and I've just learned that we should have 2 different covers on our different books and translation.
Yeah, I have to say that I've learnt lots from Julia today, and also from you, Nicola, as well. But the thing that I've admired about Gecko and my conversations with Julia over the years is probably the thing that we agree on is that children are capable of reading really sophisticated works, and they deserve it. You know, they have it, and we should provide it for them. And I guess what I found with Julia is how insightful you are when looking at manuscripts and at books, and how you're able, there's so many layers that go into a picture book, and I really enjoy the way that you articulate those layers, and you're able to see them. You know, so often people will put out a picture book and people either like it or they don't like it. But people like Julia and Nicola are very capable of actually going through those layers and telling you exactly why those are fabulous picture books, or why they fall a bit short sometimes.
That doesn't count for any of either of your picture books. Thank you both for a lovely conversation. It's such a joy for me to do this, and to share our love for picture books with whoever's out there listening. We've had some lovely comments coming through. If anybody would like to hear more from Eboni and Julia, they're going to be presenting at the annual Waikato Picture Book Research Unit seminar on the 17th of November. And I will, if you email me, I can give you more details on registration for that. It's a one-day seminar, and our focus this year is disability and inclusion in picture books. But that's all from us. Therese, thank you very much for having us, and I'll hand back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eboni, Nicola and Julia. That was a really, really fascinating presentation, and it's made me really wish that I had some of those picture books when I was growing up, because everything that I can recall from when I was little was very, very British. Anyway, thank you so much for sharing, and it's lovely to see everyone who's come along today, and I will just sign out and say ka kite anō, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.